Hi, Expositor listeners. We would like to announce our first listener contest. We know that many of you have musical prowess, and we would like to be serenaded by your talents. We encourage all of you to submit a musical piece that has to do with your experience with Mormonism, religion, secularism, or disaffection, or any other relevant topic. It can be an original piece or your rendition of a meaningful piece to you. So listen up. Send us an MP3 file or a WAV file of your musical work to mail@mormonexpositor.com. That's mail@mormonexpositor.com by April 20th. We will review all the great work, release a musical podcast, and the winner will be temporarily featured as the Mormon Expositor bumper music. You know, that music that introduces and signs off the podcast. We look forward to hearing all of your great work. Thanks.
The Mormon Expositor podcast is made possible by your generous support. Please consider a monthly subscription or a one-time donation today at mormonexpositor.com/donate.
How firm a foundation, he saints of the Lord, he saints of the Lord is laid for your faith, by your faith, his excellent word.
All right, hello and welcome to another episode of the Mormon Expositor podcast. I am Troy Olson, and I'll be sort of hosting tonight, or at least moving the discussion forward. And we have a panel of three tonight, but three, well, at least not including me, we have two very illustrious panelists, starting with the world-famous first citizen of Albuquerque, Amy.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thanks for being on. Thanks for talking about this exciting topic that we'll get to in a minute.
I'm really excited to talk about it. It's one of my most favorite scandals in Mormondom. I love it.
And then rounding out the panel, we have the first citizen of Arizona, Clay.
That's right. Hello.
Welcome, guys. And this is the next in our series, entitled the Who Is series. It's been a few months since we've done one of these, so it's time to pick it up again. And tonight we're going to be talking about who is Mark Hofmann. And I think we're going to turn this into a two-part episode. The story is very convoluted and detailed, and there's a lot going on and a lot of kind of side notes I want to tease out. And before I get started, so Amy, you said this is your favorite Mormon scandal?
It's definitely up there. I have a very vague recollection of hearing about this. I grew up in California, and so I remember hearing just kind of little bits and pieces about this, probably from Tom Brokaw on the NBC Nightly News. But I remember that this was talked about in very hushed tones by my parents. This was definitely a shameful situation that had happened, and it wasn't until I moved out of my home and moved to Salt Lake and started to I was disaffected, obviously, but it was a good 10 years before I even started looking at quote-unquote anti-Mormon material, and I really had no idea what this whole Hoffman bombing thing was all about. And when I started picking it apart and reading about it, it blew my mind, pardon the pun. It was astonishing how deep this thing went.
And Clay, you mentioned in our little pre-show talk that you don't need to tell us how old you are or anything, but that you were a little young to remember this. Is that right? Or
yeah, I definitely don't remember when it happened. I was born in 81, so I was 4 or 5 years old when it happened. Have no recollection of it happening. I knew about it in kind of my late teen years, and then investigating about the church. And actually, I recall one of my friend's moms was reading this Mormon Murders book. So I knew of it, and I knew kind of the basics of the Salamander Letter, but I definitely learned a lot preparing for the podcast, and then later in life, just when I was investigating the church.
But I think Clay said this is like a Dan Brown novel that doesn't suck.
Exactly, yeah. If you like the idea of Dan Brown, but you hate his writing, Salamander is the book for you.
There are several books, and I've read two of the ones that are out there. I've read the one called Mormon Murders, and I've read the one called Salamander, and I like Salamander a lot. I've actually in preparation for this podcast. I read it for the third time through, and it's very fast-paced. It's a great read, and it is sort of like a Dan Brown novel. I don't hate Dan Brown as much as you, Clay, but it is definitely better. All right, so a little bit of my background on this Hofmann affair. So I actually do remember it. I was in high school when this happened, and I was right there on the Wasatch Front in Bountiful. And unlike if you were out of state and you only saw Tom Brokaw talk about this a couple times on the nightly news, no, they didn't have a 24-hour news network like they do now. In fact, I don't even think we had cable back then, but it was definitely everywhere. In all the papers, the majority of the front page section and the Metro section dealt with this. On all the nightly news broadcasts, took up most of it. On the radio stations that played a lot of news, this was big. I mean, this was one of the biggest stories to happen in Utah for a long time, and it remains so. So what happened? Let's just start off sort of as I remember it. We're almost 30 years ago that this has happened, which is crazy to me because I remember this so well. On October 15th, 1985, there was a explosion in a building in downtown Salt Lake City called the Judge Building. I don't know if it's still there or not. In fact, is it still there?
It is. It's a little corner. Well, not a corner. It's a small little area in downtown Salt Lake, in between 3rd South and 4th South, and State and Main. And it's a bunch of small little kind of curling streets of older, historic, really beautifully architectured buildings. And there's a lot of law offices there and a lot of other small corporate offices. And it has the old school, old style Roman lettering. So they've restored it, but it's still there.
Yeah, I remember it. And as a brief aside, as I was rereading the Salamander book, it was almost like a trip down nostalgia lane for downtown Salt Lake City. It talks about Crossroads Mall. That's completely gone.
Now we've got a great and spacious building.
Yeah. But Crossroads Mall was great. That was, I spent a lot of time in the Crossroads Mall growing up. It talks about the Deseret Gym,
yes,
which is an old, that was where the conference center is now.
Where the conference center parking lot is.
Right. Yeah, but that was a place where when I was growing up, we used to go there for young men activities all the time because it had a swimming pool and it had a basketball court and it was a big gym. And you every once in a while would kind of spot general authorities. A lot of people that worked in the church office building would go over there to exercise or swim or whatever. But that's long gone, and that's another location here in the tale of Mark Hofmann. So back to the story. So in the Judge Building, there was an explosion at about 8:30 in the morning. And what had happened is a pipe bomb had gone off, and it had killed a guy by the name of Steve Christensen, who was a Mormon bishop living in Centerville and had kind of a famous father. For those of you who live in Utah or grew up in Utah, Steve Christensen is the son of Mr. Mack, the clothing guy. And I don't know if he still does this, but when I was growing up, he used to have kind of hokey commercials on all the time.
They're still there. They're still there.
Thank goodness. And
I waited on Mr. Mack and his wife at a little Mexican restaurant I used to work at when I was newly divorced in Bountiful, and I waited on him all the time. I waited on Elder Faust before he died, President Faust, at the same restaurant.
Which restaurant was it?
Su Casa, Mexican restaurant. There's one downtown where I'd wait on, where President Faust and his wife would come in. And Mr. Mack, I worked at the Bountiful location also, and I waited on him a few times as well.
You might have waited on me. I've eaten. When I lived in West Bountiful, I ate at Su Casa all the time.
Wow. Small world.
Yeah. I didn't ever see Mr. Mack or Elder Faust there, but
a lot of the news people like Channel 4 News and Channel 2 News people, all those Mormon glitterati types, they all live in that bench up in Bountiful by the temple. They were always in Su Casa. I waited on those people all the time.
Huh. So Mr. Mack, Steve Christensen was Mr. Mack's son. So there was a bit of people at least knew his dad when this happened, and he was killed. It was a pipe bomb, but it was a particularly vicious pipe bomb. The thing was packed full with concrete nails. And most of you probably know, but in case you don't, when a concrete nail is not a nail made of concrete, they're these heavy-duty galvanized steel nails that are meant to be pounded into concrete. So they're very heavy-duty. Whoever put this pipe bomb together obviously meant to kill the person who was there when the bomb went off. Shortly after that, I think around 9:30, another bomb went off in the Holiday area of Salt Lake City, and that bomb killed a woman by the name of Kathy Sheets, who was the husband of a guy named Gary Sheets, who was also a Mormon bishop, and was the president and CEO of this company called Coordinated Financial Services. We'll refer to it as CFS. That's what it was commonly known. That had been for a long time. It was one of those companies that got really successful really fast, made the principals of the company a lot of money very quickly. But at the time that this bomb went off and killed Kathy Sheets, the company was in a lot of trouble. So that's what happened on October 15th, 1985. Anytime two bombs go off within a couple of hours, kill two people in little old Salt Lake City, which was 30 years ago, was even, smaller and more close-knit than of a town than it is now, much more so. That was big news. There was a lot of speculation about who did this, what was the motive. Steve Christensen he also had worked for CFS up until just a few months before the bombing took place, but he was also known to be very interested in Mormon history and the dealing of Mormon documents. And during the early 80s in Salt Lake City, the dealing of Mormon documents was also kind of a big business, and we'll get into the whys and hows of that a little later. Now, to kind of complete our introduction here, the next day, October 16th, 1985, in front of the Deseret Gym, as previously mentioned, another bomb went off, this time in the guy's car, and the guy's name was Mark Hofmann. It did not kill Mr. Hofmann. It injured him, not critically, but severely enough that he had to spend several weeks in the hospital and have a couple of surgeries on his knee, and it gave him some severe burns, and it did mess up his leg, but even then it wasn't a permanent injury. So then speculation really started to fly. This Mark Hofmann guy was known as a particularly successful dealer and finder of Mormon documents, and even kind of general historical documents, but he had found some very key documents that were quite famous. Some he donated to the church, some he had sold to the church, some he'd sold to third parties that eventually gave them to the church or that had found their way into the church's hands. And so there was just all this speculation about, was this related to this Mormon document trade? Were some very zealous religious Mormons trying to kill people that were involved in this? Were these anti-Mormons? Was this the mafia? Was this related to the CFS? But it was a time of kind of speculation and fear. And once the bomb went off hurting Hofmann, that was the end of the bombs. There were no more bombs after that. So that's the background for what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of episodes. So let's take a step back and talk about the financial climate that was going on in the church and in Utah at the time. And I think I'll ask Amy. Amy's not kidding when she says she's very interested in this. She's got a detailed 5 or 6 page outline on all this stuff. So Amy, why don't you start telling us about kind of what was going on with this financial climate in Utah and the church in the early 80s?
All right. Well, I think that anyone who can remember the 80s will probably remember that it was a decade that was lit with, it was abundance. It was the big 80s, and that wasn't lost on many people. It was all about excess and wealth. And at this time, wealthy Mormons were in the media. George Romney, Willard Marriott, the Osmonds were still in the media. During the 1980s, the church was estimated to be worth anywhere from $15 to $50 billion. And of course, the discrepancy in there between those two numbers is that no one really knows how much the church is worth, because we really don't know how much the church owns or where that money goes and so on and so forth. That's a totally different podcast. There was kind of a belief, it's been said that there were many people in the upper echelons of the church that believed that in the next 100 years, the church wouldn't need to worry about converting people because it would basically own the world. So they wouldn't even need to worry about converting the world because they would own it. It would be in their pocket. In 1982, Utah was third in the nation for business defaults, and the SEC had labeled Salt Lake City as the sewer of the securities industry. So there was a lot of corruption going on. It was well known. It was a huge problem. The U.S. Attorney's Office declared Salt Lake City the fraud capital of the nation a year later in 1983. There were over 10,000 investors that had lost over $200 million in financial deals. Many high-profile church leaders were involved in lawsuits, including general authorities. And even the scam artists had something that they called the Mormon marketing strategy. And what that was is that these financial scam artists quickly realized that if you can pepper your financial deal by dropping the name of a high-ranking or well-respected Mormon, if you can somehow factor this in to how you sell your scam, people would be much more likely to partake in it because there was so much benefit of the doubt given to the reputation of the church and these men. So if they were on board, then it made a lot of sense for other people to get on board. So there were a lot of financial scams that were going on in and around Salt Lake that had a lot to do with people involved in the church. There was one, they ended up calling it the Grant Affleck affair. It was a multi-billion-dollar mortgage fraud, and it was such a serious issue because Paul H. Dunn was connected to it. I don't think he was actually prosecuted for anything, but it was because it was such a high-ranking member of the church that was involved in it. The church actually put out a public statement warning members to beware of smooth talk that claims endorsements by church leaders because they're often false. And some members think that normal business formalities should be suspended when they're dealing with the quote-unquote brothers and sisters, and this unfortunately can lead to fraud. So the church was really aware that this Mormon marketing strategy was being used by scam artists, and that the church was kind of taking a hit with this because so many people were losing money, and it was reflecting really poorly on Salt Lake City in general, but also with the church.
This actually reminds me, again, I grew up in Utah during the 80s, and we actually had a guy on our ward, and I'm pretty sure this was not uncommon. This guy kind of showed up in our ward, and he was one of these kind of real outgoing, friendly guys that he ended up in the stake council within, as best as I can remember when I was a kid. It was within a year or so after moving into the ward. He never was promoted to bishopric or bishop, but he was kind of one of those guys that would have been on track for that, just his personality and being involved in kind of everything. And it turned out that he was selling tax shelters. I've mentioned before I'm a tax lawyer, so it was a lot bigger than your investment, and that was supposed to, shelter your income. So this guy was selling a bunch of those, and it turns out that a lot of them were fraudulent, as you can imagine, and we call abusive tax shelters in the tax world. So this guy sold a bunch of those, and a lot of people in our ward ended up getting in trouble with the IRS because of this, and this guy kind of ended up getting run out of town, essentially. But I do remember that, he was a guy who was kind of involved in this, what did you call it, the Mormon marketing? What?
Mormon marketing strategy.
Yeah, the idea was, okay, insert yourself in this pool of either potential clients or victims or marks, whatever you want to call them, and use your position in the church to get these people to trust you and then sell them some crap and make a bunch of money for yourself and, hopefully not get run out of town like this guy got run out of town. But I mean, I remember this very vividly, this type of stuff happening when I was growing up. One thing I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, I think you mentioned something like that some people at the time were saying the church wouldn't need to convert people, that it would eventually have enough money to own the world or own. Yeah, I don't remember that so much. Can you give us a little more background on that?
Well, the best I can say, and I don't know if this is really going to answer your question or not, or give you the information you're looking for, but wealth, I mean, I'm sure it was a tongue-in-cheek statement. I don't know if the Mormon Church has ever hoped or dreamed of ever actually owning the world, but accruing financial assets and having money in the Mormon Church, and I think probably most of our listeners can agree with this, it is definitely a sign of righteousness. And it's spoken of in the Book of Mormon as far as money is a blessing. You know, people who are righteous are entrusted with wealth or financial opportunities. And this was very much still an open conversation that the church was having with its members. In the mid-1980s, G. Homer Durham gave a talk in La Jolla, California. And if anyone out there is familiar with where La Jolla is, it's a very affluent area. And he gave a talk to in a stake conference, and he was praising this bishopric and the stake presidency on how balanced their books were. And he spent an entire, I don't know, half hour, 45 minutes talking about the blessings of money and how this ward was, or this stake was especially blessed because, to quote his talk, the acclamation of wealth is a sacred obligation. What he didn't really realize at the time was that the stake was actually fairly racially and financially diverse. And they received, the church office building received so many complaints about his talk that they never sent him out there again. Later on, Durham became a go-between for Mark Hofmann and Gordon B. Hinckley when these documents started to trade hands, and he eventually took over as church historian to protect some of these documents that the church would eventually get their hands on. So the idea that the church was going to take over the world with money, I think it was more conjecture and just maybe a symptom of just the general financial climate of the 80s. But back then, the church was very unapologetic and very unabashedly speaking about finances in the context of righteousness and having wealth. They were very explicitly and unapologetically spoken of in those terms.
Yeah, and just to add a couple things that I think are related, I think that thought is still alive and kicking in the church, that if you're righteous, you'll gain wealth. I remember as a missionary, Russell Nelson gave a talk, and he essentially reinforced that, saying, normally we think that, you know, if you're righteous and do what God wants, then you are financially well off. And threw in a caveat like, well, that's not always the case, but normally it is. And then two is just to get it kind of the context of all these financial dealings of church members and whatnot. And I know we're going to get into this, but a lot of the people involved during this time were part of those types of organizations. We've already talking about CFS, and Gary Sheets and Christensen that used to work there is kind of one of these companies. Also, we're going to talk about a guy named Brent Ashworth. That I don't think we addressed his business dealings, but he was the owner of Nature's Sunshine, which is a alternative nutrition or a nutritional supplement company, which doesn't sound so crazy, but then it's actually a pyramid scheme. And I don't know if he's still the owner, so I can't say. But, you know, in South America, a lot of church members sold this stuff. And essentially, it's a pyramid scheme where people go and they look at the irises of your eyes and tell you what ails you, and then sell you mango powder and whatever else to fix your liver.
Is it like the Tahitian noni that's being sold in Orem right now?
Well, it's a similar idea, right? But it isn't noni. It's a whole suite of nutrition supplements that supposedly will, heal you of what ails you. But then there's this whole idea that, I honestly saw church members looking into other people's irises, and they had a map of where dark spots showed up on the iris that would mean that your kidneys are unbalanced or whatever, and then sell these nutritional supplements, and then also get other people to sell it under you, kind of like Amway type of a deal. So just to give context, yes, that was all going around in Utah, and it was going on in the lives of many people involved in this whole debacle.
Wow.
Utah's got to be the capital of the multi-level marketing.
Well, and it's also the capital of nutritional supplements, in that the government was going to pass something to regulate these things because it's an unregulated business. And Utah officials says, no, we're not going to have it because it's a huge part of the economy. They make these things there, and then they peddle them as actual medicine. And anyway, we're getting off on a tangent.
What it illustrates is that the church culture, and it sprung from a kid who was digging around in the dirt for gold treasures, and spirits were showing him things and pulling things back into the earth when he wasn't righteous enough to see them. This entire, from the get-go, the entire climate of belief is kind of tied into, in some regards, really, fantastical thinking and ways of being. And, it makes sense that people would Mormons might believe that if you look into someone's irises that you might be able to tell if their kidneys are functioning, even today, so.
Well, there's the big one now. Well, there's several big ones, but I'm on the East Coast, and there's a lot of people within the church that sell this essential oil stuff. I forgot the name of the company, but
I have a friend whose husband sells that stuff.
Yeah. That's those oils are definitely essential, and they have, it's now 2013, so they have fancy brochures and websites and everything but I think it's pretty much the equivalent of looking into somebody's iris, looking for dark spots, and instead, they have just the essential oil to heal what ails you there. But yeah, we're off on a tangent, but it's pretty funny. One last point I think that I want to make is I don't know that this culture has changed all that much. When was the last time someone got called to be a general authority that was a butcher at Albertsons?
Never.
I think in the early days of the church, and maybe even I haven't done the research to support this, but I think even up until, Boyd K. Packer, I think, was a seminary, a CES employee, and some I think of the older guys weren't necessarily these big business successes or successful lawyers. But now it really, it seems like if you are not a financial success, you really,
you're not poised to move up the chain unless you can prove that you're financially successful.
Right. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And because the message that it sends to the members is, just like you were saying, Amy, it goes back to the Book of Mormon. If you're being blessed financially, it must mean that you're also doing it right in your spiritual life. And therefore, you're worthy to be called as a leader, and people, put their trust in you and everything. And, how much of that is actually based on spirituality, and how much of that is based on, well, this guy's successful, so he could be able to run a stake because he can run his company really well.
Absolutely.
So now we've set the financial climate, and as Clay mentioned, several of the players here that we're going to be talking about were very wealthy guys. I think in the note she sent, Amy, it said that in 1985, this dude Gary Sheets made $600,000, which in today's dollars would be over $1 million, for sure. And also in the book that I just finished rereading it, I'd forgotten this from previous readings, but Steve Christensen also was pretty wealthy. For 85, he was making, I think in 84, he made $300,000, and it mentioned how he would always, he was on his third BMW, and every time he'd purchased a new one, he'd moved up, a series in the BMW line. Not that I know, because I drive a Honda, but
I like you better for that. You're ready to take off.
I'm at least worthy of being a 11-year-old scout leader with that kind of a vehicle.
Hey,
And also, some of these guys are relatively young, right? I mean, I think Christensen was in his early 30s, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's
Yeah,
not
these
like these
they all-
are 50-year-olds that have built their empire and are getting ready, 60 plus, ready for retirement. These are kind of young, up-and-coming businessmen.
But let's talk about the CFS company, because this is going to play into the bombings and some of the speculation on what the motives for the bombings are. So I'll turn it back over to Amy to tell us about CFS.
Okay. Well, as you mentioned in our general introduction, at the time of the bombing, CFS had lost a great deal of money in some of their business investments. And there were many people that thought because of these business investment losses that these bombings were a mafia hit and that they were being put out by investors. When CFS
because some of the investments were supposedly in Las Vegas as well. So that's kind of where the mafia connection comes in. Supposedly.
CFS, they quickly became a very large company. They went from 2 employees in 1975 up to 120 in less than 10 years, and they were making tens of millions of dollars. There was an employee by the name of John Conrad who was who was kind of, that kind of water cooler conversation that you have where you're bragging about all this money you're making and all the cool things you did over the weekend in your Cessna and how your wife got a new mink or whatever. And he was bragging to a couple employees, one of them happened to be Steve Christensen, that they had stole about $55,000 worth of land for development, and it was a little planned community called Paradise Cove. And, in modern day terms, $55,000 worth of land is probably like a $2 or $3 million land deal at this today. And when Conrad talked to Gary Sheets about it, John Conrad talked to Gary Sheets about it, I think Gary was kind of not too pleased with what he was hearing, or a little questioning about what he was hearing. And he just looked at him and said, you're too damn stupid not to recognize that this is the best financial opportunity that you could bring to your clients. And John Conrad later recalled when he was interviewed that he realized that he was working with really prominent members of the church, and he was beginning to realize that the faith that he had in them based on their church dealings was diminishing his ability to recognize, or, I don't know, discern, for lack of a better word, their ability to be honest businessmen. And so there was a lot of inside corruption that was going on within CFS. Not everybody was on board, but it was kind of a general knowledge in the company that, you take what you can get, you make the money, you get in, you get out. And if you don't want any part of this, well, you're just too stupid to make this money anyway. And it should be left up to us. So just, move along. Nothing more to see here.
Well, I guess a lot of people ended up being stupid because they started investing in all kinds of weird stuff and then started losing a bunch of money. And again, shortly before the bombings took place, they hadn't filed for bankruptcy yet. They eventually did file for bankruptcy, but the writing was on the wall, as it often is with companies that go bankrupt, that was inevitable. There was talk of fraud indictments against some of the principals, including Gary Sheets. And so Steve Christensen, who was working for Sheets, eventually left. He, a couple months before the bombs went off, he bailed on CFS. And so that kind of sets up, there was all this speculation with respect to the bombings about Gary Sheets with the bomb, but instead killed his wife.
Yeah, it was definitely meant for him. It was not for her.
Right. Well, I think that the package, these bombs, I neglected to mention, were in cardboard boxes that had been addressed to the recipient with a black felt tip pen. And one was to Steve Christensen and the other one was to Gary Sheets. After these things blew up, they the bomb squad or the police were able to recover enough of the box so they could see that. And the one to Christensen, eyewitnesses in the judge building saw that it was a package had been left for him there. Now, the one that blew up Hofmann, for reasons that will become obvious later, was not addressed to anyone. And that also is sort of the one that doesn't fit the CFS story because Mark Hofmann had absolutely nothing to do with CFS.
And Sheets' wife's name's Kathy, right? Isn't that who died in that other explosion?
Yeah.
I don't think we ever mentioned who died in that second bombing. We said that it blew up at the Sheets' home.
Oh, okay.
But it killed Kathy Sheets, who was Gary Sheets' wife.
Right.
Yeah, that bomb had been left, and we'll probably talk about it more, but the bomb was left on the front walkway. And she had left that morning through the garage. I think she went to go walk a dog or with some friends or take a walk around the neighborhood or something. And so she went out through the garage and she didn't leave through the front door, which someone would very plainly see the box sitting there. So when she came home and was approaching her home, she saw that there was a package sitting on the front walk, and she went over to see it, and it blew up. So that's how that
and
happened.
Because we started with the bombs, we keep coming back to them, but the bombs were triggered with mercury switches, and so what that means is they were intended to blow up whoever picked up the box, because the mercury, as we all know, is a liquid metal, and so when you move the box, the liquid would complete the circuit inside there that detonated the bombs, and so whoever, even though they were addressed to Gary Sheets and Steve Christensen, anyone who picked up the box or knocked the box over or did whatever they needed to do to get that mercury to move within the switch was going to be blown up. Now, the second bomb, the one that killed Kathy Sheets, did not have the concrete nails. It was a pipe bomb, and obviously it was a deadly pipe bomb because Kathy Sheets died. It was different from the one that killed Steve Christensen in that it did not have the one that killed Christensen was definitely intended to murder because of the tightly packed concrete nails, and that was missing from the Sheets bomb.
Those concrete nails, they are about 2.5 inches long. And based on the autopsy report that I read, he was beyond mangled. It was bad news for him that day.
Yeah, I mean, the woman that found him in the hall post-explosion said there was essentially a hole through his torso where he had bled out through.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was not good. And all through this, even though a lot of time has passed, it's still very sad that for these two people and their family that were completely innocent victims of this, this scumbag, essentially. I don't really have any other...
He was just like a slime ball. He was just a swarmy little snake of a guy.
Well, let's start talking about this swarmy little snake of a guy as we continue in our chronology here. We've set the stage. Now let's go back in time a little bit and talk about this guy, Mark Hofmann. I mean, I would call him a sociopath for sure. I guess after he pled guilty to the bombings, he was examined by some psychologist from BYU who concluded he was actually not a sociopath. But based on his behavior, I can come to no other conclusion.
Like Amy said, the guy was, he was a bastard. He was terrible.
Some of the things that he did, even from an early age, and you can pick up on this in any of the books that are out there. He liked to play with fire. He liked to hurt animals. There is a story in the Salamander book about, I can't remember if he was at a cousin's house or a neighbor's house, and they apparently had a bunch of cats at this, I think it was his cousin's house. They had a bunch of cats kind of running around, and one of his favorite things to do was take the cats up on the deck and throw them off, knowing that, well, I don't know what he knew, but the cats wouldn't kill them. The deck wasn't high enough to even break the cat's legs or anything.
But it's talking about 25 to 30 feet, I think it said in the book.
Yeah, but he was definitely intending to hurt the cats, or thought he was getting some kind of a thrill out of causing these animals pain, which is, I'm not any kind of psychologist or know anything about it, but what little I know about sociopathy or just bad dudes in general is they have a tendency to want to hurt animals at an early age or hurt other people. And that's a characteristic that Mark Hofmann had. And he also became very interested in forging things and kind of fooling people at an early age. Anyone want to talk about the coin that he forged at an early age when he was his early teen years anyway?
There are some conflicting accounts as to what age he actually began his real forging career. But sometime between the ages of 12 and 14, he figured out that he could change the circa letter on coins showing what year they were made. And he somehow came to possess an old Mormon coin, and he managed to change the circa letter on this coin, and it increased its value from a few $100s to a few $1,000. And later on, after everything came out that he was this master forger, and they were and the U.S. Mint and other people, the Smithsonian and other places that had ended up getting a hold of some of his documents, because he didn't just end up trading in LDS documents. He did some other documents that were supposedly to be very valuable. But even after all was said and done, and the U.S. Mint knew that they were looking at a Hofmann coin that was 99% likely that it had been forged, they then even couldn't tell that it had been faked. It was just assumed based on the history of this kid and the value of the coin and how it came to be, that it was very likely that he had forged it. So he was very skilled. He learned very early on how to forge documents and forge and kind of falsify certain types of glues and how to age certain kinds of inks. And he was known to just kind of hang out by himself in his basement a lot, even when he was an older adult and was married and living at home with his wife. His wife was never allowed to go down into his basement because he had this little lab kind of set up where he would execute his forgeries and create his inks and create his glues. And he would buy old books. In books, there's usually, a couple blank pages and then maybe a publication page and then another blank page and then a title page and then a blank page and then a table of contents. And he would buy these old books so that he could have authentic aged paper in which to create these forgeries. And so once he learned how to age the ink just so, he would put it on this paper that was proven to be 200 years old, and he would create his forgery, and so would go the sale.
So are you saying there's something wrong with hanging out by yourself in your basement as an adult?
Only
if you don't let your wife down there and
if you're down there playing World of Warcraft, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not. Usually I'm watching TV. I'm not much of a World of Warcraft man. I also don't have a lab, but I do. I do like to hang out in the basement alone. That's my weekend, man.
I think this is an important point, though, Amy. I think that people that aren't well acquainted with Mark Hofmann and with the forgeries, people like myself who, were too young to really remember this, I think people have the misconception that it was some chump Mormon who was fooling gullible Mormon historians and gullible church officials. But he tricked the best of the best. He tricked the authenticators. Absolutely. He tricked, like you already mentioned, it wasn't only on the Mormon circuit that he was forging things. It was on the national circuit. And I think people really need to realize that this man was devoted to crime and deceit, and he did it well.
The man who eventually bunked the Hitler diaries, he took a look at the Salamander Letter, which we'll talk about later. But even he was not able to suspect any reason to suspect it was a forgery. So he was the best of the best. I mean, there's no denying that this guy was A1 on top of his game. And he knew it. And he had the balls to ask prices to prove that he knew that he was going to get away with it.
Yeah, a couple other things about him I wanted to bring out before we get into the forgeries. We're going to get into those in good detail here in a minute. But sort of in addition to the things I've mentioned, that he liked to play with fire and he liked to hurt animals, he really got a thrill out of manipulating people, of fooling people.
Well, and also even to his own wife. I mean, there's evidence that the wife that he finally married, which it talks a lot about in the Salamander book, was essentially a wife that he felt he was able to control, create a facade with, and a wife that would do what she was told to manipulate that relationship to his own benefit.
Yeah, Amy, in the books that you read, did it talk much about his fiancée, the one he did not end up marrying?
Yes, but I didn't really spend a lot of time, researching or looking at that because he was a very interesting fellow when it came to his relationship with Mormonism, and I think it's something we should discuss since we're ready to get into the forgeries, as to what would motivate someone who was, by all accounts, I mean, obviously, on the dark side of Mark Hofmann was that he was a slime ball and he, obviously was a firebug and threw cats off buildings and things like that. But to the people that knew him outside of those experiences would have probably thought that he was just your average garden variety young Mormon kid. And he started to become disillusioned with the church after he found out that his mother had come from a polygamist family after the Second Manifesto. And most of our listeners, if they came from Mormon Expression, they are probably familiar with the manifesto banning polygamy and know that there was more than one because polygamy was not outwardly being practiced anymore, but there were a few, well, I don't know about a few, there was a group of preferred Mormons, I guess, that were being allowed to practice polygamy with the protection to some degree of the church. And when he realized that his mother was part of a family that was practicing polygamy after the Second Manifesto and was not receiving the kind of protection or legitimacy that he felt the church should have given her, he was outraged that she was being forced to live this lie that was being perpetuated by the LDS Church. And he set out to investigate who had married his grandparents or his great-grandparents. So that kind of got him started into digging through Mormon history and kind of unraveling the mystery, as it were. And it began to crumble, I guess, his testimony. And he stopped believing in God and eventually identified as what he would consider an atheist. And he was so resentful of what he learned through not just discovering who married his mother's family in a polygamous setting, but he realized that he wanted to take down the church. He wanted to expose all of these little frauds, all of these lies, all of what he called institutionalized deceit. He wanted to get that out. And he decided that the only way he was going to be able to do that was to continue this farce and pretend to be this decent, believing Mormon man on the outside. But on the inside, down in his basement, he was going to start creating these documents that were going to reveal with enough truth, with enough fact, that it would lend legitimacy to the document, that he would bring out what Mormonism and what early Mormon history was all about. And that's what brings us to why these documents started to be discovered and how and why he came to create them.
One kind of overriding thing I want to mention here is a lot of the story comes from Hofmann's confession when this is all over with. And one of the problems with that is we've already established that this guy was a deceitful manipulator and a compulsive liar. So it's a little hard to know exactly what he was thinking because we only know from what he told the investigators at the end. He did say, I think he lost his in the confession. He said that he'd lost his testimony at the age of 14, and at that time he started coming up with this plan to discredit the church. But also he did go on a mission. He went to England on his mission, and the folks that wrote the Salamander Letter, I guess, had interviewed several of his former missionary companions, and they all said that he spent a lot of time reading, quote-unquote anti-Mormon literature. Included in that is the Fawn Brodie book that is not considered, I don't think, anti-Mormon literature anymore, but back in the 70s when he was a missionary, that was probably one of the hallmarks of what people considered anti-Mormon literature at the time. And so I don't know exactly when he abandoned his belief, if he ever had any kind of a belief. It is, I think, well established that one of his motives here, in addition to just kind of jerking people's chains for fun, is that he did want to harm the church in some manner through these forgeries.
And there is evidence, Troy, that when he was dating the girl that he was engaged to prior to marrying his wife, they had the discussion that he essentially said that he had no testimony in the church, but that he wanted to live the facade and maintain appearances. I think those were his exact words.
I remember that, and by this time, he actually already started into the document, well, what turns out to be the document forgery business. Okay. But at the time, people thought he was a legitimate finder and dealer in rare Mormon documents, and he specifically says, I can't do that job he doesn't use the word apostate, but if people don't think that I am part of the church, I don't have any credibility with my custody, with the people that are going to be buying my documents. So I have to keep up the appearances. So he loses his faith, as Amy says, sometime, learns a lot about church history through his own investigation, spends a lot of time reading the Tanner's Mormon Shadow or Reality book, and just kind of hanging out at the Tanner store. I don't know if he hung out there, but he had some kind of correspondence. Yeah, right.
He liked to go in and kind of drop little gems like, oh, I heard about this. What would you guys think about that? Or, hey, I was going through my box of stuff and I came across my grandpa's old second anointing letter. What do you guys think of this? He was kind of trying, and what I think he was kind of trying to get a feel for, in the earlier days before he really started to go after it, to see how right the belief was for this stuff to start coming out, and who better to start with in the church's, at that time, biggest enemies, but the Tanners.
Yeah, and I guess from what I remember, that second anointing, it was supposed to be the actual ordinance that at the time, I guess, I think they'd stopped doing it at that time, but the prophet himself had to give, and he took this thing in that was a piece of paper that said Salt Lake Temple, please destroy after reading or something. Yeah. So it turned out that it was a complete forgery, but yeah, he went in, he didn't offer to sell it to them, right? I think he just let them have a copy of it.
Yeah, he just gave it to him and walked away, and thought he was kind of a weirdo.
Which turns out to be true. But that was, I think, the first document that's at least known that is the Mormon document that he invented or created and then put out there in circulation.
I think that's also, before we jump into the document, sorry I keep derailing us, but I think it's important to notice, we brought up the second anointing. Part of Mark's credibility and his genius is that he really didn't introduce anything into the document world that was already rumored at or somewhat concluded within the Mormon historian realm. We also have to say that this was during the big Arrington days, the new Mormon history days. People knew about folk magic. People knew about all these kind of shadowy systems. People know that the second anointing took place and takes place. So every document that Hofmann produced fit within some preconception of what early Mormonism looked like.
Absolutely. He was genius at it. How he managed to spin these yarns, how he introduced these stories that he produced documents for. Criminally insane, literally. Just a genius.
Well, let's jump to the first of his major. They're sort of, for purposes of this podcast anyway, we're going to talk about kind of three major forgeries that he came up with. There's more than three, but kind of the early Hofmann years, of three major forgeries. And one is the Anthon transcript. So just like you said, Clay, a document that people thought probably existed. I mean, the account of Martin Harris going to visit Charles Anthon is in the Pearl of Great Price and the Joseph Smith history. It's a well-known story, but no one had ever been able to locate the actual document that Harris presented to Anthon. Well, until our good buddy Mark Hofmann came up with it. I haven't called on you very much, Clay. You want to kind of give us the skinny on the Anthon transcript.
Well, sure, and just as background to the Anthon transcript, we have the official position of the Anthon transcript that Martin Harris goes to this academic translator, presents some symbols that Joseph Smith supposedly wrote from the golden plates directly on this paper and asks Anthon to translate them. And Anthon, according to official Mormon history, translates them and then gives it back and says, yeah, these are legitimate. And Martin Harris leaves and says, oh, well, this is part of a golden book that Joseph Smith found. And then Anthon gets mad and says, hey, I can't translate it from a sealed book and this is bogus. But later on, as Fawn Brody says, Anthon supposedly refutes this claim and says, listen, he brought me in these symbols. I said they were bogus, said I can't translate it without seeing the book. I don't know what you have here, but I don't see anything legitimate. So Mark Hofmann forged this document, jump in and correct any errors that I'm making, that essentially supposedly had the symbols from the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith wrote down, because nobody really knows what those symbols were that Martin Harris handed over to Anthon.
Ooh, tell how the document came. Tell how the document came.
Oh, I forget.
You mean how it was discovered?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Well, wasn't it when his wife walked in or something like that?
Well,
But it was tell.
Okay, well let me go down this story and you can correct me where I'm wrong, but supposedly Mark Hofmann's wife walks into this room. Hofmann says, hey, I just found this in this book. What is it? It's sealed with glue. I don't know what's going on. I'm going to take it to my buddy up at Utah State University. I think his last name is Simmons. And Simmons was a former student of Arrington, but a non-Mormon. And Hofmann goes up to Utah State University and it was all glued shut. And hey, I found this document and it looks like there's some symbols on here. I don't know what really is in it. And the two of them spend a long time trying to unglue it and undo it, and finally they cut it open, and both of them are just floored that these are the symbols from the Book of Mormon and supposedly, what Joseph Smith had transcribed from the golden plates, and fill in the details where you find them appropriate. But
yeah, well, it was a Martin Harris. It was supposed to be a Bible. A Bible
it was supposed to be a Smith, Joseph Senior Bible.
Yeah.
An old family Bible.
Right, that had been passed down.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the Bible itself was the Bible itself authentic.
The Bible was legit.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he forged the signature stating that it was part of the Smith family, but he had, like I had mentioned earlier, he found a way to replicate this old style of adhesive glue. And
it's a pitch, like a sap glue is supposed to be.
Yeah. And he took 2 pages of the Bible and he shoved this little Anthon, this alleged Anthon transcript, he folded it up and he put it in between, kind of made it like a little pocket between these 2 pages, and he shoved it down in between and sealed the edges, and it had this mystery of what have we found. Just carefully, I can just imagine them carefully peeling these, trying to not tear it, and what do we do and what do we have? And oh my God, people were just popping boners over this stuff.
Well, they said that like one side was unsealed, so they were like peeking down this folded paper, trying to read it. It's like a kid trying to find out his Christmas present, and finally they get it open.
And he had created this entire. He had laid the stage. I can't imagine how pleased he must have been with himself to create this mystery and to spin this yarn, and knew that they were going to open this page up and knew that they were going to, what do you think it is? Do you think this? Oh my God, it's the Anthon transcript. Could it be?
Yeah.
This was sitting right next to the Book of Mormon, and Joseph Smith really wrote this down, and oh my God, the church is true.
Yeah, well, he was,
but also having some heavy implications, right? That now all of a sudden, again, these things that fit in with history, but also have some hard-hitting implications that, oh, wait a minute, it's a circle with a cross in it? That doesn't mean anything. You know what I'm saying? So, now having it in light, being able to see, is this a legitimate language or not? Yes, it's this amazing treasure and amazing and beautiful and exhilarating. But what does it do to Joseph Smith's credibility?
Yeah, well, he was kind of genius in several ways of coming up with this thing. So, like you mentioned a few minutes ago, Clay, he didn't ever invent anything new. He just filled gaps. And so in the No Man Knows My History book, there's actually a picture in there of some characters that David Whitmer, there's an existing document, I have no idea where it is, but there's a picture of it or a photocopy of it in the No Man Knows My History book of a picture of David Whitmer. So there is an existing piece of paper that David Whitmer possessed that has survived through the ages that's supposed to be Joseph Smith copying what he had put on the Anthon transcript. So the characters are, a picture of some of the characters are in the No Man Knows My History book. And then Anthon himself described the characters as well. Some of them looked Egyptian, some of them looked Greek, some of them looked Roman. And then there was like a circle that looked kind of like an Aztec or, a Mexican calendar or something. And so Hofmann took that description, he took the David Whitmer document and then created the thing that it fit exactly with what Fawn Brody or with what Anthon himself had said it looked like. And then the other genius part of this, he just didn't come up with this thing by himself. He didn't just show up with it one day and say, hey, look what I found. He put it in the book and had other people actually discover it for him in the Bible.
Yeah, this is what it made him like the golden child, because obviously someone that wanted, or I'm sure he's thinking, he has to set the stage so he doesn't look like he's trying to get the glory. He included all of these other people in the discovery so that it would lend legitimacy to the discovery itself. Brilliant on his part. And it created a bunch of excitement. It created a lot of chatter. It created a lot of interest. And what ended up happening, obviously, is that the church hears about it, or he brings this attention to the church, and there's already this kind of this hubbub surrounding this. Who is this Mark Hofmann kid? He's just this college student, and he's found this Bible, and he took it to so-and-so, and then so-and-so did this and that, and now we have the chance to have this potential sacred document, and it's the Rosetta Stone, literally, for the origins of the Book of Mormon. Of course the LDS Church wanted it.
Yeah, and kind of everybody, another kind of genius thing about this is people on both sides wanted this thing to be authentic. The church obviously wanted this to be authentic because it substantiates this whole Martin Harris going to Anthon story, and it, like you say, these are characters that were, literally copied from the gold plates by Joseph Smith. And the other side wants it to be real because Anthon himself says, well, here's the characters. It fits his description perfectly, and the later description where he repudiates Martin Harris's story and says all these characters were just gobbledygook or, a mixture of all these kind of weird things, and it also substantiates his story. So every historian interested in Mormon history wanted this thing to be authentic. It was, which kind of, answers one of the overriding questions with this whole scandal is, how did Hofmann fool so many smart people with these forgeries? And one of the many answers is he only produced documents that, not only at first, when he was gaining his credibility, he was producing documents that a lot of people wanted to be authentic because it would support stuff that they previously believed.
Right. Hugh Nibley predicted that the discovery, quote, promised as good a test as we will ever get of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, because Hugh Nibley believed that these Egyptian characters, Reformed Egyptian, would eventually be properly translated because obviously this Anthon character didn't know what the hell he was dealing with, and that the translation of this document that Hofmann produced or discovered was going to prove that the Book of Mormon was an actual historical record.
Yeah, and then we should kind of jump ahead here. What Hofmann did with this, so he had it authentic, it was discovered by this Simmons guy who was a historian up at Utah State who thought it looked real to him, had it authenticated by church
Ultraviolet.
historians. Yeah, ultraviolet analysis.
An infrared examination, and a church handwriting analyst. They all, quote unquote, authenticated it.
So essentially what authentication means is they test the paper. It is from the 1800s. They test the ink. It is consistent with ink from the 1800s, and they look at the handwriting, and it's consistent with the handwriting of the person that they're comparing it to.
Yeah, this shit would never fly today.
Maybe.
Maybe.
I'm not so sure.
Get down to your basement, Troy.
Yeah, I should be doing something that's productive, making money down there. I got to come up with some forgeries. And on the back of the transcript, the handwriting we're talking about, it's kind of hard to analyze the handwriting of the characters against anyone because they're just characters. But the other side of it had Joseph Smith, had a holograph, which means a handwritten document that's signed by the person whose handwriting is on there. Joseph Smith saying, this is what I gave to Martin Harris to send to Charles Anthon. And so essentially Joseph Smith himself authenticating what this thing was and how important it was. And the handwriting, according to Dean Jesse, who still is one of the leading experts, probably the leading expert on Joseph Smith's handwriting and on Joseph Smith's personal writings. Dean Jesse himself authenticated this, said, the handwriting is consistent with Joseph Smith's handwriting. The signature is consistent with Joseph Smith's signature at the time. So this is an authentic document. And then Hofmann furthered his credibility by taking this very exciting, fantastic document and just donating it to the church.
Well, no, let's not put the believer spin on that. He didn't donate it to them. They wanted him to donate it, but he politely convinced them that he would trade it to them, and he actually received in trade about $20,000 worth of items from the church archives. They gifted him, whether it was, I think, some gold coins.
There was some money and some letters and some...
Yeah, he definitely did not give it to them as a gift. He traded it to them.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, but the initial, the story was that it was donated.
Well, of course, because it makes everybody look good if he donates it.
Yeah, but he did get, about $20,000 worth of authentic documents.
Exactly. He really
trade.
Cleaned up.
Yeah. His profit margin, we'll get to this in part two. I still have a hard time understanding how he let this thing go downhill because, the profit margin in forged documents is pretty good.
Yeah, he was greedy. Maybe he had like a stable of prostitutes or something that he was spending his money on. Because I don't know how he managed to need as much money as he needed, and which is why he kept so much of this going, is because he needed so much money based on his promises.
He did talk about... I'm sorry. He did talk about a lot of New York trips and strip clubs.
Nice.
Just that thrown out there. That was
before Giuliani cleaned up Times Square, too.
That's right. Back in the good old days.
Yes.
If it were me, I just would have spent it all on candy and gum.
Well...
So he donates the Anthon transcript to the church, and this, I don't know if either one of you know this. This I've always thought this was pretty funny. So when I was on my mission, I'm sure you're both very familiar with the missionary books of Mormon that folks hand out, the blue cover.
Guys, yeah.
So you might have seen the ones that they used to hand out, the paperback books of Mormon that were light blue with a picture of the Angel Moroni from the Salt Lake Temple on the front.
It had all the Mayan temples in there.
Yeah, so, so in between light blue Angel Moroni missionary book of Mormon and the current dark blue one that we have now, they actually had a gold one that was a replica that they used the Anthon transcript. Do you remember seeing these?
I do, and I'm trying to, every once in a while I get on eBay and I try and find someone that's being reasonably bid upon because I want to have one for my own.
I never knew about these. You just blew my mind.
Yeah, so this was I'm dumber than a post because when I was on my mission, we had these things. They had been recalled because Hofmann had since been everybody knew that the Anthon transcript was a forgery at this point. So the church quit producing the missionary books of Mormon with the gold plate edition. But we still had them in most of the apartments had a few copies. I can't believe that I just didn't have the foresight to take one of those home and say this
To
is
steal? You can't believe you didn't have the wherewithal to steal a Book of Mormon from your mission home?
Borrow.
No. This was, well, okay, you could, whatever. Sure.
Read, Amy. Read and study. That's all you had to do with it.
So it was a Book of Mormon. The cover was gold, and then the front and back had a replica of the Anthon transcript that Hofmann forged. And since these were, it wasn't like, I was giving this away for free every day, so I guess I wouldn't have thought of it of stealing, just to kind of keep one for myself. Even if I would have gladly paid the $1.50 or whatever.
Troy, why would the church do that? I don't understand this, and maybe you have a better perspective about this, but why on earth would the church print ridiculous symbols that mean nothing as legitimate Reformed Egyptian that doesn't exist in a Book of Mormon that they're handing out to investigators?
Well, because
it looked
this
cool.
was authentic. Yeah, I mean, it looks cool. It actually looked, whatever.
It was way cool. It was a golden book, and it was shimmery in the sunlight.
Yeah, the cover looks cool, but those symbols do not look cool, man.
They don't care about that. They don't care about that. That doesn't matter.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
It's an unanswerable question. I understand that. It does not make sense to me that they would print something like that.
In hindsight, I agree with you, Clay, but in 1980, this was discovered. I keep saying discovered. This came forth or whatever, created in 1980 and donated to the church in 1980. And again, this had been authenticated by everybody. Everybody thought that the Anthon.
Well, let's qualify that. It had been authenticated as Joseph Smith's signature and his handwriting on the back. Those have been authenticated. The symbols are not authenticated worth anything, except for supposedly they're made in the ink that was used in the 1800s and on the paper.
I see what you're saying. So just I guess that's similar to the point I was making before, is that even historians who didn't believe the church's claims regarding the origins of the Book of Mormon were excited about this because Anthon disparaged these characters and said this is just garbage.
Yeah, they're hokey.
Yeah, so why would the church do that? Well, I'm with you. That is an unanswerable question. I think whoever made the decision in the church office building that, hey, it would be awesome if we printed a bunch of these out to give out on the street, wasn't thinking in terms of, but what if these characters aren't legit? I'm sure they were thinking this is 100% legit, and this is cool, and it's catchy, shines in the sun or whatever. So let's print these bad boys and start distributing them. And so they did.
And now I need one.
How much are they on eBay these days?
Oh, I haven't looked for a while. Maybe like $40 or $50.
Wow,
that's not bad.
That's where I'm going to probably call
I see
it.
some future tattoos in your future.
If any wonderful listener out there wants to gift me with a gold Book of Mormon, I will send you dirty emails.
Now I really wish I would have brought one of those. I actually even did like a Google image search to see if I could see one, and I couldn't even find one on the Google image. Maybe
Kurt Bench from Benchmark Books, and then also Sam
Weller
Books. They have an old collector's edition in Salt Lake that they have a lot of that old stuff in there.
So we need to continue to move forward here. Let's move to another of the three kind of main documents. Well, there's more than three, but
there's hundreds, and we'll provide a link that will lay out all of the documents that he forged. I mean, everything from journal entries to letters that literally have nothing to do with Mormonism but just corroborate the fact that Mormons were in town, to court documents, affidavits. This guy did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of forgeries, and these are just the three that most closely illustrate the Mormon problem with him.
History had to literally be rewritten. I mean, D. Michael Quinn was writing his early Mormonism and the magical worldview while all this was taking place. He had to go back, rewrite, and take out references to certain documents, which we'll talk about in the future.
And one that we'll talk about right now, speaking of books that had to be rewritten, a book that was in the works at the time was Mormon Enigma, and they had a whole chapter on this next document that they later had to remove from the book. And the next document we're going to talk about is the Joseph Smith III blessing. Now, unlike the Anthon transcript, this was a document that was not one that the church was all that excited about. So the Joseph Smith III blessing, we actually are going to have someone read the content of the entire blessing so that you will know what it says or what it said. And so go ahead and listen to that now.
A blessing given to Joseph Smith III by his father Joseph Smith Jr. on January 17th, 1844. Blessed of the Lord is my son Joseph, who is called the third. For the Lord knows the integrity of his heart and loves him, because of his faith and righteous desires. And for this cause has the Lord raised him up, that the promises made to the fathers might be fulfilled, even that the anointing of the progenitor shall be upon the head of my son, and his seed after him, from generation to generation. For he shall be my successor to the presidency of the high priesthood, a seer and a revelator and a prophet, unto the church, which appointment belongeth to him by blessing, and also by right. Verily, thus saith the Lord, if he abides in me, his days shall be lengthened upon the earth. But if he abides not in me, I, the Lord, will receive him in an instant unto myself. When he is grown, he shall be a strength to his brethren, and a comfort to his mother. Angels will minister unto him, and he will be waft as on eagle's wings, and be as wise as serpents. Even a multiplicity of blessings shall be his. Amen.
That is what the Joseph Smith III blessing, which is, again, a Hofmann forgery. It's kind of weird to talk about these as if they were real, but at the time, people thought they were completely and totally real.
And again, a Hofmann forgery that purportedly existed in real life, right?
Right.
That there were rumors of this Joseph Smith III blessing, and Hofmann subsequently produced a forgery to corroborate that.
Yeah, he was basically just providing the corroborating evidence. He was just the lucky fellow that was able to unearth all of these gems that people had been talking about in hushed tones or rumors or whatever, or hopes that they didn't exist, and he was bringing these to reality.
And so, and as you just heard, the Joseph Smith III blessing is a blessing of the Joseph Smith. It was a blessing Joseph Smith Jr. gave to Joseph Smith III that said he would eventually lead the church, be the next prophet, that he had the right of succession according to Joseph Smith. And of course, that's what was then known as the reorganized church believed and still believes, the Community of Christ now. And that had been their claim all along. Again, he's filling a gap in history that people thought might exist or that did exist. The reason, of course, that the LDS Church was not all that hip to learn about this document is that it would, if true or authentic, it would cast doubt on Brigham Young's right to succession in the presidency.
Well, the letter, and how this letter is presented, is that it is actually, the blessing is actually couched in another letter, in that it is written by someone to Brigham Young by saying, you didn't destroy all these copies of the blessing. Look what you've done. How could you have done this? Here's a copy of the blessing. I've just found it. You were supposed to destroy them all. And Hofmann takes it to, he walks into the church office building in 1981, and basically with the hopes that the church is going to snatch this up for serious money, because they are going to want to bury it on the spot. They're going to buy it, and then they're going to hide it, because they don't want anyone to know that this letter exists. And that was part of his manipulation in creating these documents that were going to be negative towards the Mormon churches, because it was more likely that they were going to buy them and that he would be able to continue with these forgeries, is because they wouldn't be made public. Hopefully some of them wouldn't be made public. Therefore, he wouldn't be detected as creating false documents, because the church would never acknowledge that they even existed.
And he deftly markets the document to the church, the LDS mainstream Brighamite church,
Yes.
and the community of the now Community of Christ, then reorganized
Yes.
church at the exact same time.
Yes, he pits them against each other.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I think the way that I remember this, a couple things. So the letter was supposed to be written by Thomas Bullock or Bullock. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce the dude's name.
Bullocks.
Thomas Balls.
Sorry, keep going.
So Thomas Bullock sends a letter to Brigham Young, and the way I remember it was slightly different than the way you remembered it. I think he was telling Brigham Young that I'm in possession of a copy of the Joseph Smith, a copy of the Joseph Smith III blessing, and I will not give it to you because even though I believe you are the rightful prophet, I know you're destroying all copies of this, and if I send you a copy, you will destroy this copy too. And I want to keep this around or whatever. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong.
Both versions are probably true, depending on who was spinning it.
Yeah, right.
Truthfully.
Yeah. And so Hofmann takes this thing he takes the actual blessing itself, which is separate from the letter, and says, hey, I've got this, and expecting, like you just said, Amy, for the church to buy it on the spot and bury it, but they balked. They either at the price he was asking or if it was authentic or whatever, but they initially said, well, no thanks. We're not going to buy that for what you want. And then he went to the RLDS Church, and they obviously wanted it. And in the Salamander Letter, it talks about how the historian for the RLDS Church was, really mad at Hofmann because he essentially promised that he would give RLDS Church the right of first refusal on the thing. But then he, he pitted the two churches against each other to see how high of a price he could get for it. And the Brighamite branch was able to give him more money, and I think he got a bunch more stuff in trade again, like he did for the Anthon transcript. But this reorganized church historian, vowed he would never deal with Hofmann again because of his, blatant dishonesty and dealing and kind of pitting the two organizations against each other.
Interestingly, something that I didn't expect, and I have to commend the Brighamite LDS Church for, is at least in the Salamander book by Silito or however you mention the author, the mainstream LDS Church said something to Hofmann as if saying, listen, if you've got deals with the RLDS Church, we're not going to undercut them and buy it out from underneath them. Go ahead and figure out your deals. If you can sell it to us, we're interested. If not, we'll deal with it, kind of thing. Which, that was something commendable that I didn't expect within their dealing. At least within that narrative, the LDS Church did not buy it out from underneath the community of Christ.
Yeah,
They actually ended up giving it. They purchased it. And to kind of backtrack a little bit, this whole pitting back and forth against each other, not only was the RLDS person decide he wasn't going to deal with Hofmann, Gordon B. Hinckley, upon seeing this huge, media nightmare that was happening publicly, these two warring factions of Mormonism, basically, Gordon B. Hinckley decided that from now on, it's going to be me that deals with Hofmann and me only. And when the church eventually purchased the blessing, they got to, in turn, gift it to the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in exchange for an original Book of Commandments. And the Brighamite Church ended up making about $10,000 in that trade based on the value of the Book of Commandments. So everybody except the Reorganized Church made money on this one.
Yeah, they got stuck with the forged blessing. Now this is, as we discussed this is becoming more clear to me. So we're actually talking about two separate documents. We're talking about the blessing itself, that's the thing that the LDS Church gave to the RLDS Church in exchange for the Book of Commandments. Then there's the Thomas Bullock letter to Brigham Young that got buried. So, according to whoever you read, President Hinckley or, whoever at the church, they did not release the Bullock letter. That was put in the First Presidency Vault or wherever they put these things, because that, of course, cast Brigham Young in a pretty bad light.
And he had a stellar reputation up until that point.
Well, okay. In fairness, I think that Arrington's book on Brigham Young was probably out at this time. I can't remember when that was published, and that's
hagiography. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's hagiography. It's saint worship. It's Arrington's book on Brigham Young is. I love Arrington. Don't get me wrong, but it's storytelling and kind of idolizing.
Right. Yeah, I think that's I don't know that there's really any...
That's what the LDS Church does best, is they deify their past leaders.
And I don't want to speak poorly about Arrington, because Arrington was, for a lack of a better vocabulary, he was a badass. And he opened up a lot of honest church history, and he initiated and carried on and facilitated a lot of new Mormon history. Having said that, his Brigham Young biography is not as scholarly and rigorous as it could have been.
Well, I don't think there's any debate about that it definitely cast Brigham Young in a positive light. Especially, it's definitely more positive than the recent one that came out. And I forgot the author of the one that just came out, even though Brant interviewed him on one of our episodes. I forgot his name.
It's hold on. I've got it on my bookshelf 5 feet away.
Well, and just
his last name's Turner. Turner is the last name.
Yeah.
And just to also illustrate to use your term, Clay, what a badass Arrington was, is that because he had such a desire to open up the honest dialogue, a more honest dialogue within the church, after the church started accruing all of these documents, Arrington ended up getting the shaft and was released from his church historian position and sent down to BYU, because I personally think the church was worried that he was going to start exposing, for lack of a better word, in an attempt to be honest, some of the things that they were hoping would never see the light of day.
Oh yeah, that's
no doubt.
That's completely accepted. I guess the most well-known piece of that story is that in 1980, the very same time period that we're talking about here, the church was supposed to begin or publish this 16-volume history of the church that was supposed to replace the B.H. Roberts comprehensive history of the church, and every one of the different 16 volumes is going to be authored by a separate scholar. And of course, we all know Arrington headed that project up, and the first volume, it's actually ended up being published. It's Joseph Smith and the Beginning of Mormonism by Bushman. But the church put the kibosh on that because of the early work that the historians were doing did not sugarcoat. I don't want to.
It told the truth.
Okay.
It told the truth.
Right. It did. It at least, yeah. It attempted to present an honest history, and that's where we get, the whole new Mormon history that we've mentioned a few times here. But I guess getting back to the point I was trying to make about this Bullock letter being buried by the church or not publicized is, I think in 2013, where we are now, Brigham Young's reputation is not what it was within the church back in 1980. And it probably still is among, believers that haven't really looked into church history all that much.
Oh, God. My dad thinks Brigham Young is the tits, and he's read every bad thing you can think about it, and it just makes him more tits.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't get it, but whatever.
All that racial, rhetoric really makes him think he's a badass.
Hey, you know what? Sometimes the Lord needs to do unpopular things, and you can't kill the messenger. Brigham Young was just telling it like it was, and that's how it is. You don't like it? Take a leap.
Yeah, well, here, because I'm a believer, I don't, I've been on several episodes, and it's not, I don't hide that. I'm happy, proud of that and all. But from my believer's perspective on how to deal with Brigham Young is that my whole philosophy on the way that the prophet thing works, the way that I think about it is the Lord selects whoever is going to do, who is most likely to kind of do his will for that time. And in my mind, when the church was new and kind of starting out, he needed kind of a bastard to
interesting
to get just to make sure the church didn't fall apart, and
the blacks would have definitely done that.
Well, I don't want to, this is a side topic we can argue about later, but I think that's definitely not going to argue that Brigham Young
was a racist, misogynist.
Yeah, that I think that the Journal of Discourse is it speaks for itself. It speaks for itself. So, but, so getting back to the Bullock letter, that it wasn't going to cast Brigham Young in a favorable light, and it was also going to cast doubts on the whole debate over who really had the right of succession. Was it Joseph Smith III or was it Brigham Young? And so that's sort of the next piece of this Hofmann puzzle. The first big document we talked about that he donated / traded for other valuable consideration to the church was the Anthon transcript that the church was real excited about and real happy to publish in the Ensign and real happy to create a missionary Book of Mormon with the gold cover and symbols. Then he produces some documents that the church is like, hey, wait a minute.
This doesn't fit into our worldview. What's up?
I'm not sure about these documents, but because this dude Hofmann had established his credibility by producing the Anthon transcript, there was also a document we didn't talk about, a letter from Lucy Smith to her sister talking about how, Joseph's divine work in translating the Book of Mormon, and it actually, I think, contained some references to stuff that was supposed to have been in the 116 lost pages. That was another document that there was a press conference and Hofmann presented it to President Kimball, and
that letter would have been, if it were true, the first documented piece of Mormon history of one person relaying Mormon history to another. It was literally the first historical document from one family member to another, one person to another, that this whole thing of Mormonism really existed.
Right, yeah, definitely would have been a very important document if it had been real.
Yeah.
So
all of this stuff would have been life-changing were it real.
So, but then he has the credibility from producing those so-called good documents. Then he produces kind of an iffy one, or a couple of iffy ones, and the church is now in a bit of a bind because they're like, oh, well, we trust this guy. He gives us good stuff, but now he's giving us some less than good stuff. But we can't really say, yeah, this guy...
We don't know what to do with him.
Yeah. And we can't disparage his credibility because we've published all this other stuff about the great documents. And so, yeah, like you said...
And we also can't make him mad either.
Because he will...
Sell it to other buyers.
Yeah, he's got other buyers, and there's a lot of references to enemies of the church in books. And Hofmann saying, well, especially in his dealings with President Hinckley and other church leaders, I've got to, I want to protect the church. I want to keep this stuff out of the hands of the enemies of the church. And so I'm giving you the right to buy this stuff, or, in the cases where he just gave the stuff to the church, I'm doing this. I'm on your side, church.
And let's be clear, and I'm sure all our listeners know, that the First Presidency does have a vault, and that vault is inaccessible. And they do have a place where they can sync documents that will never see the light of day.
Yeah, I can't remember if this is something I read or if this was an interview that I saw on the internet somewhere with Michael Quinn, because I think he's actually seen the First Presidency vault. And there's actually two. When you talk about the First Presidency's vault, there's a couple things. There's like a vault in the traditional sense of a kind of a room or an area where they put stuff. Then there's also literally a safe that was in the possession of Joseph F. Smith, who was Hiram Smith's son, and has been passed down to Joseph Fielding Smith, and the church is now in possession of it. And that vault is supposed to, I think that either Quinn, I can't remember, I'm sorry, listeners, but I have read an account of someone who has seen the contents of that actual safe, and there's some cool stuff in there, like the seer stones, the actual seer stone that Joseph used to translate the Book of Mormon. I think
allegedly.
Well, he used it to produce the Book of Mormon, whether you call it a translation or whether you call it he made it up. I mean, I think that...
Or whether you call it a seer stone or you call it a rock.
Right. Well, okay. Whatever.
Or you even acknowledge that he did that.
Well, I think that you mean acknowledge that he even put it in a hat and...
Yes.
I think
that's pretty well accepted. That he had his face in a hat?
I have not spoken... No one in my family would ever acknowledge that.
Oh, I see what you're saying, Amy. I keep forgetting that our audience is...
Oh, you're saying that whether he did that or the Urim and Thummim. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Right.
I misunderstood. I was thinking our audience, everybody who's listening to this at this time knows about the rock and the hat. The so-called, TBMs, as much as I hate that term, probably aren't aware of that method of translation. They are
even though it was written in the Ensign in the late 70s and
right, yeah. So, but you go see the Joseph Smith movie in one of the visitor centers, and they show him with his finger on the plates.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. I forget that.
That I'm a smartass?
No. I was thinking in terms of we're talking amongst ourselves.
Documented history is what you were saying, Troy.
Right.
Is that it's well documented. It's accepted that he did have his face in a hat.
Yeah.
That did happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but because I am, I know that I'm a believer. I would love to see that seer stone, but because the general membership doesn't know about that, or that they're never going to pull that out of the vault and say, "Hey, we have the seer stone. Let's put this in a museum where it belongs." And I think another thing that's really cool in there is I think that a pair of Hiram Smith's garments are in there. So the original pattern,
full length and collar and all that stuff.
Right, yeah, but there's only pictures of those and who knows how accurate those are.
Let me tell you this. I used to work construction in the mountains of Idaho, and I wore a pair of my great-great-grandfather's garments that were not full length and collar, but they were down to the shins and down to the mid-arms and hand-cut and sewn in the symbols.
Really?
Yeah. Because it was cold up there in Idaho, man, and somehow I had got a pair from somebody, and this is way too much information I recognize, but yeah, I used to sport those bad boys.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, you can still buy thermal garments.
No, but back to the vault. Another thing that's long rumored. Never officially confirmed, is that Oliver Cowdery's version of the origins and evolution of the church is in there.
Right. How did we get off on the vault? Oh, we were talking about that there really is a place where if a document
wants to disappear, it's there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
If we needed 1984 this piece, we're going to do it in the vault.
So one of the things that another thing that Hofmann was doing here is he would give these sensitive, I'll call them, documents to the church, and then or sell them or trade them or whatever, and then give either President Hinckley, and I think it was almost always President Hinckley, the impression that, hey, I'm giving this to you as a favor, do with it what you want, and with the expectation that the church was going to, put this in the vault or whatever. But then he would leak to the Mormon underground
that it existed.
Yeah, that they had this, and it would force the church eventually. They did this with the Bullock letter and with the
Salamander.
Yeah, the Salamander letter, the Josiah Stowell letter that we'll talk about in the next episode. He put it out there that these things existed, and sometimes even make photocopies of the forgery and then put that out. And the Mormon underground, they're sort of like what the internet Mormons are today, but they didn't have the internet back then, so they actually had to trade documents amongst each other and stuff. And so people knew that this was out there, and so when the pressure got enough that the church kind of had to admit, yeah, we have this. So Hofmann was, intentionally doing that. On one hand, telling President Hinckley, hey, I'm your friend. I want to keep this stuff out of the enemies of the church's hands. At the same time, delivering it directly to the enemy of the church's hands, and then forcing the church to look, bad by saying, oh, yeah, well, we had this, but we, essentially were suppressing it.
We were just waiting for the right time. We were waiting until the people were ready.
We wanted our experts to look at it before we released it to the press. That's a couple things.
Yeah, they had all kinds of stuff they would say.
Why don't you tell our listeners what they can expect in our upcoming possibly two episodes, one or two episodes?
Well, I'm going to start the next episode off by singing a rendition of the theme from The Love Boat.
Yeah.
Okay, then.
And then...
Only if you follow it up with Fantasy Island.
Was there a song that went along with that?
There was a soundtrack that blew my mind.
So what we can expect on the next couple of episodes we are going to continue our discussion of some of these important documents that Hofmann forged and sold to the church. And then...
and how those documents ended up in an explosion that killed 2 people and wounded another.
We also want to talk about the investigation, because that's
where it gets messy for the church.
Huge.
It's pretty messy at this point based on this podcast, but yeah, the investigation is amazing, and all the double dealing that Hofmann was doing, and sort of how this kind of, like I said, he had a good gig going with just, if he would have just stuck to a couple of customers and a few forgeries a year, he'd probably still be doing this.
Yep. It would have completely changed what the Mormon church is today. as we know it.
Yeah, well, and according to his plan, his overall master plan.
He has a plan. It will change every man.
So,
that kind of?
Yeah.
Exactly.
But he got greedy, started doing all kinds of double dealing, and we'll get into that. The investigation brings all that to light, and it, literally blew up in the end. Not on him. Well, yeah.
It did blow up on him.
Blew up on his leg and arm.
And his nuts. That sounds grotesque, but according to the Salamander book, his nuts were injured.
Yeah.
Oh no, not the nuts.
I've said that before. We'll continue with part 2. So until then, thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.
For refuge and fled.
This episode was hosted by Troy, produced by Amy and Heather, and the music was provided by Matthew Crowley. Thanks for listening.
The Mormon Expositor, Mormon Expression Voices, Feminist Mormon Housewives, and Pesquisas Mormonas podcasts, as well as other educational initiatives, such as the Mormon Archive and Mormon Audio Library, are made possible by your generous donations. Please consider a subscription today.